news YouTube page for daily highlights. ChatGPT said, "Power in modern politics is not only measured in votes, armies, or trade balances, it is also measured in the capacity to shape narrative ecosystems." When a sitting president declares that the American Broadcasting Company and the National Broadcasting Company deliver 97% negative coverage and therefore deserve to lose their licenses from the Federal Communications Commission, the immediate question is not only whether such a move is legally possible, it is whether the threat itself functions as a strategic instrument. The words land inside boardrooms, law departments, newsrooms, and affiliate stations, and they also land far beyond the United States, where allies and competitors read signals about how American institutions treat dissent, journalism, and the boundaries of executive power. What follows is a cold assessment of the architecture of American broadcasting, the legal and constitutional guardrails, the political incentives that encourage brushback rhetoric, and the probable domestic and international consequences of using licensing language as a tool of pressure. We will also examine a different, arguably more durable, strategy for contesting media bias that leverages persuasion rather than preemption. The objective is not to adjudicate whether network coverage is fair. It is to analyze how power is exercised around the claim of unfairness and what that exercise implies for the information order inside and outside the United States. Begin with structure. The American broadcasting system is not a single switch that a White House can flip. Licenses are held by local broadcast stations scattered across the country, not by the national networks whose logos anchor morning shows and nightly news. The American Broadcasting Company is a network. The National Broadcasting Company is a network, but the transmission authority that lives or dies at the Federal Communications Commission applies to the individual stations that carry network programming over the public airwaves. The Commission can grant, renew, or revoke those station licenses according to statutory requirements that speak of the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That phrase matters because it turns generalized anger into a procedural question. What is the evidentiary basis that a specific station failed its obligations? In practice, license revocation is rare, slow, and litigious. It requires a formal process, fact-finding, and an administrative law record that can survive judicial review. The First Amendment does not disappear at the Commission's door. It does not immunize broadcasters from every form of regulation, but it forbids viewpoint discrimination by the state. Saying that a network runs too many negative stories about a president, even if one accepts the premise, does not by itself meet the standard that would sustain a revocation attempt in federal court. This is why experienced communications lawyers reach for a different tool set. They file complaints about specific, provable violations. They point to failures of children's educational programming requirements or technical noncompliance. They argue about ownership caps, localism, and concentration. None of that turns on whether coverage is flattering or hostile. The legal design channels raw politics into narrow, technocratic corridors. The second layer is institutional independence. The Federal Communications Commission is led by a chair and a slate of commissioners who serve staggered terms. They are political appointees. They are not insulated like lifetime judges, but the structure still demands process. During any presidency, there will be commissioners aligned with deregulatory philosophies and commissioners with more activist inclinations. The temptation in every White House is to treat independent agencies as extensions of the political apparatus. The safer reading of American constitutional practice is that these entities must be seen performing independence if their decisions are to survive challenge. That is why references to individual commissioners by name and the suggestion that a single official is at the helm create friction with the underlying reality of collegial decision-making and multi-member votes. Even if a commissioner is known for cutting red tape, even if a commissioner speaks the language of free markets, the path from a presidential social media post to a station losing its license still runs through notice, comment, hearing, and review. The architecture slows the translation of rhetoric into punishment by design. Yet, Slowing is not the same as neutralizing. In politics, words are not vapor. They reprice risk. A public company that owns stations, studios, or networks reads a presidential threat and imagines regulatory friction, legal bills, and headline risk. The board asks the general counsel for a briefing on exposure. The general counsel assigns internal teams to audit vulnerabilities. A sale or merger under negotiation gains a new column in the risk register. A producer weighing an investigative segment recalculates the expected value of pushing ahead. None of this requires actual revocation. It requires uncertainty. Markets and bureaucracies are conservative institutions. They tend to avoid friction when the path of least resistance will do. Executive language can therefore function as a form of soft control, not a direct order, but a reminder that any future dispute may be judged in an environment less forgiving to the disfavored party. This is the brushback pitch analogy. A fastball thrown inside, not to hit the batter, but to reclaim the plate. In baseball, the pitch works. In a constitutional republic, its wisdom depends on whether one believes chilling effects are a feature or a bug. The analysis has to ask not only whether the tactic is effective in the near term, but whether it builds the information ecosystem a governing coalition needs in the long term. Proponents of aggressive rhetoric argue that legacy newsrooms are systemically hostile, that editorial rooms are culturally aligned with one political faction, and that complaint, however loud, rarely changes the product. They point to negative story ratios, to newsroom donation patterns, to the framing of questions in presidential interviews, to the placement of corrections relative to the original allegations. They argue that many journalists act, in effect, like political operatives with press credentials. From this vantage point, harsh words are not merely justified, they are overdue. If adversaries in the press deploy every tool available, why should an elected executive restrain himself from using the tools at his disposal? The broadcast spectrum is a public resource, the argument goes, and the state has a duty to prevent its capture by partisan actors masquerading as neutral arbiters. That is the core claim embedded in the charge that negative coverage rates approach the high 90s, and that the American Broadcasting Company and the National Broadcasting Company are de facto arms of a rival party. The advocacy follows a straight line from diagnosis to remedy: call out bias, shame the perpetrators, and threaten their licenses until they recalibrate. Skeptics approach from the opposite direction. They accept that newsrooms are human and imperfect. They accept that bias exists. They also argue that governments that punish editorial lines by wielding licensing machinery cross a constitutional red line. If a Democratic administration announced that a conservative channel would lose access to spectrum for hostile coverage, the right would call it censorship. By symmetry, a Republican administration that singles out networks for negative coverage invites the same charge. The principle, these skeptics contend, must be stable across administrations or it is no principle at all. They add a prudential argument. The president in question has already demonstrated that rhetorical combat can defeat adversarial media without licensing threats. He has won elections in the face of hostile coverage. He has won lawsuits against powerful outlets. He has leveraged alternative media channels at scale and set the agenda through direct communication. If the strategy has worked without licensing coercion, why risk shifting the battlefield onto terrain where constitutional backlash is likely and judicial defeat is possible? The sword may be blunt in court, but sharp enough in the marketplace of ideas. Both camps underestimate a deeper dynamic. The most durable objective in any long campaign is not victory in a single case, interview, or lawsuit. It is the progressive erosion of public confidence in rival arbiters. When an executive zeroes in on legacy media credibility, the target is not merely the next headline, it is the social trust that allows those institutions to frame reality for millions. The presidency is a megaphone. When the voice at its center repeats that the old gatekeepers lie, distort, and coordinate, two things happen. First, loyal supporters feel licensed to ignore inconvenient reporting as partisan noise. Second, the institutions under attack become more risk-averse, more legalistic, and sometimes more brittle. The result is a strategic environment in which legacy media remain influential, but their ability to discipline political actors with exposure diminishes. This is not a uniquely American phenomenon. Around the world, leaders from democratic and authoritarian systems alike attempt to discredit media they cannot control. The United States is different because the First Amendment is older and stronger than comparable guarantees elsewhere. But the psychological mechanics are universal. Delegitimation works slowly, not completely, and not without counter effects. But it works. The counter effects matter. The more the presidency says that media cannot be trusted, the more the public looks elsewhere. Independent creators, podcasts, newsletters, and social video channels grow faster. That shift does not always produce a more accurate information diet. It often produces a fragmented one. Algorithmic feeds slice audiences into demographically and ideologically distinct streams. Each stream carries confidence, outrage, and insider vocabulary. The old networks are not replaced by a single new authority. They are replaced by a constellation of micro-authorities. In this environment, a president can dominate conversation by sheer gravitational pull, but even gravity faces limits when the universe expands. Licensing threats aimed at legacy networks do not reverse this fragmentation. They may accelerate it by sending undecided audiences toward outlets that neither the White House nor legacy media can fully influence. The strategic question becomes whether a governing coalition prefers a smaller, more loyal public square or a larger, more competitive one, in which adversarial institutions retain legitimacy. That is not a legal question. It is a statecraft question. There is also a narrow, tactical alternative to licensing rhetoric that deserves high weight in a rational media strategy: disciplined engagement on hostile turf. When senior officials, who are fluent, calm, and prepared, appear on unfriendly programs and disassemble the scaffolding of loaded questions in real time, two outcomes follow. First, the core audience sees that the administration can withstand aggressive scrutiny and still articulate a coherent program. Second, the host network faces a dilemma. Either it continues to invite officials who perform well, thereby delivering the administration airtime, or it stops inviting them and concedes that it prefers monologue to dialogue. In both cases, the administration gains. This method has been tested. It is usually more work than writing a post. It requires briefing books, repetition, and message discipline. It also compounds over months and years. The result is not silence from adversarial media. It is a demonstrable track record of victories in their studios. When such victories stack, accusations of bias still have bite, but they are no longer the only weapon. They are complemented by a portfolio of visible performances in which tough questions are answered, reframed, and neutralized. The licensing fees argument sits in the same analytical frame. The airwaves are public. Stations pay fees and comply with service obligations. And the idea that networks should pay more because their coverage displeased the incumbent is a political instinct, not a policy principle. If the government were to raise fees uniformly for every network and station based on neutral service metrics, the legal risk would be manageable. If it raised fees selectively for disfavored brands, the legal risk would spike. Even a facially neutral change would be examined for pretext when the surrounding rhetoric signals punitive intent. In the law of administrative action, motive matters. Courts read records. Counsel draft memos with that reading in mind. A White House that prefers to win rather than signal will therefore separate the substance of spectrum policy from the theater of media combat. That separation is not easy in a polarized ecosystem, but it is essential if the goal is to maintain leverage over time. Lose one high-profile case on pretext grounds and future attempts to regulate the sector on neutral grounds become harder. At this point, the analysis must zoom out to the international plane. When the United States threatens to punish broadcasters for editorial stance, even if only in words, foreign governments take note. Allies in Europe and Asia who rely on American security guarantees also rely on American arguments about liberal order, free expression, and the rule of law. American diplomats lecture counterparts in autocratic capitals about the dangers of state control over media. Those lectures lose force when adversaries can point to quotes from an American president and say, "You do the same." The claim is not strictly accurate in legal terms, because American institutions retain constitutional guardrails that many regimes do not. But diplomacy operates in the currency of appearances and quotes. Every sentence that sounds like licensing retaliation becomes material in the brief that hostile states file in the court of global opinion. Conversely, when an American president defeats hostile coverage through rhetorical skill, data, and policy performance, without reaching for licensing levers, the soft power argument strengthens. It says, the American system produces adversarial media and powerful executives, and the latter still prevail without suppressing the former. For countries navigating media reform, for dissidents and journalists who benchmark their safety to American norms, that difference is not academic. It is a lifeline. History adds context. Past administrations have chafed at coverage and explored regulatory responses. The Fairness Doctrine, a policy that once required broadcasters to present contrasting viewpoints on controversial issues, was abandoned in the late 1980s on the theory that it chilled speech and that the growth of cable and digital media undercut the scarcity rationale for intrusive rules. Since then, both parties have flirted with bringing it back or reinventing it in digital form. Neither party has found a stable principle that survives the right test. Would you accept this rule when your adversaries administer it? Presidents have criticized networks by name. Presidents have frozen out specific reporters. Presidents have tried to influence ownership fights behind the scenes. The institutional memory of those efforts is a cautionary tale. What changed in the last decade is the scale of the presidential megaphone on social platforms and the speed at which corporate actors respond to perceived threats. A post that once would have been a line in a stump speech can now move markets in hours. That reality gives the presidency new leverage and new responsibility. It is also necessary to reckon with genuine media failure. Newsrooms do make errors. They can be sensational. They can cluster around narratives that flatter their audience's priors and neglect stories that complicate them. Corrections can be buried. When high-profile mistakes occur, they validate the executive narrative that the legacy press is unreliable. That validation is not wholly unfair. But there is a distinction between saying the press often fails and saying the press is illegitimate. The first critique encourages competition and improvement. The second critique encourages eradication. Strategic actors who expect to govern for years should be careful about shortcuts that feel satisfying in the moment and impoverish the ecosystem in which they must operate tomorrow. An administration that wants policy coverage to be more rigorous and less hostile can invest in rapid response teams that bring primary documents to the public within hours of a story, make white papers digestible to general audiences, and seed knowledgeable surrogates who can navigate hostile interviews without retreat or anger. None of that bars sharp criticism of media conduct. It does convert that criticism into a dual power strategy: condemnation plus competence. There is a final consideration that cuts through legal doctrine, institutional design, and media sociology. Presidents govern coalitions that include citizens who distrust government as a matter of philosophy, and citizens who want government to punish enemies as a matter of tactics. Licensing threats appeal to the second group more than the first. Over time, the first group is often more durable. It is anchored in constitutional language and identity rather than momentary grievance. Executives who wish to maintain a broad coalition will therefore minimize signals that the state will decide which speech survives and which speech is extinguished. They will let rhetorical warfare do the visible work and let process do the quiet work. When they do reach for administrative power, they will do so with clean records and neutral justifications that survive litigation. They will understand that the commission that grants, renews, or revokes today may be controlled by adversaries tomorrow. They will internalize the symmetry test. The president has already shown that he can beat hostile outlets with the tools of narrative dominance. He has leveraged direct channels to speak around legacy gatekeepers. He has put adversarial interviewers on the defensive by reframing questions and refusing their premises. He has won cases in court. Those are demonstrations of power that do not depend on revocation rhetoric. The occasional brushback pitch may feel, in the moment, like an efficient way to compel respect. But respect forced by licensing talk is not respect. It is fear, and fear decays into defiance as soon as the balance of power tilts. A colder logic says, make them chase your story because your story is better built, better sourced, and better delivered. Put your best communicators into the studios that dislike you most, and let them perform. Reward outlets that engage in good faith with access to facts before they are public. Punish outlets that fabricate by flooding the zone with primary evidence. And when regulators act, make certain the record is about law, not loyalty. None of this requires conceding the claim of bias. It requires translating that claim into a strategy that compounds. The public is not a monolith. It contains citizens who will never trust the American Broadcasting Company or the National Broadcasting Company, citizens who never watch broadcast at all, and citizens who still take their cues from precisely those anchors. A governing strategy that can move each of those segments by 2 or 3 degrees is more valuable than a threat that moves one segment by 20 and others by -10. Over the next cycle, the metrics that matter are not only share of favorable coverage or the number of lawsuits won, they are the rate at which undecided voters believe they are hearing facts, not chance. That rate rises when the presidency projects a confidence that does not need the commission to police speech. Outside the country, adversaries will continue to weaponize presidential posts as counter-propaganda. Allies will continue to translate American institutional choices into their own debates about regulating social platforms, funding public broadcasters, and drawing lines between criticism and defamation. The United States has an interest in those debates ending with more room for dissent, not less. It has an interest in being able to say, credibly, that a system of vigorous political combat can coexist with independent journalism, even when journalists are wrong, arrogant, or unfair. That claim is part of American deterrence. It is part of the civilizational argument that says free peoples can be trusted with complicated truths and that their leaders win by persuasion rather than prior restraint. When the presidency acts with that horizon in view, domestic fights about media bias become raw material for a grander narrative. The United States can withstand criticism and still govern because it is built to withstand criticism. The coldest logic sees that narrative power is not zero-sum. Every time the White House forces a network to air a correction because the administration produced documents within hours, every time an official turns a hostile cross-examination into a teachable exchange, every time a policy paper lands with clarity because communicators built it for ordinary citizens rather than lawyers, the legitimacy of the executive project grows among those who do not attend rallies and do not subscribe to legacy papers. The presidency does not need to threaten licenses to achieve that. It needs discipline, speed, and a practiced belief that confident governments can defeat unfair stories by making better stories true. If the next season of American politics follows that line, the country will look back on the licensing talk as what it was, a momentary flex that revealed a genuine grievance but obscured a superior strategy. The superior strategy is harder. It is quieter. It wins more often. It also leaves the constitutional order stronger than it found it, which is the only durable victory in a republic that values both executive strength and a free press. In the end, the choice is not between silence and subjugation. It is between 2 forms of power. One is the power to threaten and chill, which delivers immediate satisfaction at non-trivial legal and diplomatic cost. The other is the power to argue and prevail, which delivers delayed satisfaction but compounds over time and builds an information environment that can outlive a single term. The president who prefers the second form will still criticize networks harshly, will still mock unfair questions, will still call out partisanship masked as journalism, but he will reserve the machinery of licensing for the narrow cases where neutral law demands it. He will trust that the American people can hear competing claims and nonetheless recognize results. He will remember that the most effective way to delegitimize adversaries is not to silence them, it is to make them demonstrably wrong in real time, again and again, until their audiences migrate by choice. That is the strategic logic that aligns constitutional restraint with political advantage, and that is the logic most likely to endure beyond today's quarrel and into the larger story the United States tells about itself to the world.